Hello, my friends. It's been a long time, it seems like. I'm back and we're going to start a new book today. We finished up our Western, The Quick and the Dead, and now it's time to start a new one. So, the one that I've chosen is one that I read this summer just out of interest, and I loved it a lot. It's called Ruby Holler, and it's by Sharon Creech. She wrote some other books, Walk Two Moons, and other things that you might have heard of. So, we're going to read Ruby Holler. Chapter 1 is called The Silver Bird. Dallas leaned far out of the window, his eyes fixed on a bird flying lazily in the distance. Sun slanted through the clouds above as if a spotlight were aimed on the bird. A silver bird, Dallas thought, a magical silver bird. The bird turned slowly, suddenly veering south over the small town of Boxton, toward the faded yellow building and the window from which Dallas leaned. Dallas stretched his arm out. Here, he called, over here. The bird swooped toward him and then rose up over the building, high, high into the air. Over the alley and the train tracks and the dried up creek, Dallas watched it rise on the air currents over one brown hill and then another until it disappeared. He tried to follow it in his mind. He imagined it flying on until it spied a narrow green valley, a scooped out basin with a creek looping and winding its way through the center. He pictured it swooping down from the sky into the basin and the hills, and to this place where cool breezes drifted through the trees, where the creek was so clear that every stone on its bottom was visible. Maybe the silver bird had flown home. Get out of that window, a voice shouted from below. No leaning out of windows. Dallas leaned a little further out and called down to Mr. Trepid. Did you see that silver bird? Get out of that window or you're going to join your sister down here pulling weeds, Mr. Trepid threatened. Dallas spotted his sister Florida inching her way along the sidewalk, wrenching clumps of weeds and grass and dirt from the ground. Putrid weeds, Florida snarled, heaving a clod of dirt over her shoulder. Dallas watched as the clod landed on Mr. Trepid's back, and as the man scuttled over to Florida, whacked her on the head. Dallas wished the silver bird would return and snare Mr. Trepid and carry him high up over the town and then drop him splat right in the middle. Chapter 2 is called The Boxton Creek Home. Boxton was a tired town, a neglected place that looked as if it was in danger of collapsing on itself. A tangle of old homes and shacks clustered around small stores and buildings that had seen better days. One of these buildings was the Boxton Creek Home for Children, a ramshackle house that tilted toward the train tracks and hills beyond. In this building lived the bungling managers, Mr. and Mrs. Trepid, their assistant, Morgan, and 13 children, ranging in age from 6 months to 13 years. The two oldest children in the Boxton Creek home were twins, Dallas and Florida. They were tall for their age, dark haired and dark eyed, with sturdy frames and a rough edged and unkempt look about them. Dallas was the quieter of the two and the more inclined to daydreaming, while Florida was loud and squirmy, with her mouth full of words bursting out and her face full of expression, flashing from surprise to disgust in an instant. The managers of the home, Mr. and Mrs. Trepid, were middle aged, cranky and tired, and growing stiff and cold as winter bound trees. They believed in rules, and their rules were posted on doorways and in hallways and above each child's bed. There were general rules and kitchen rules, bathroom rules and stairway rules, basement rules and outside rules, upstairs rules and downstairs rules, clothing rules and washing rules, cleaning rules, rules upon rules upon rules. If we didn't have rules, Mr. Trepid liked to say, everything would be chaos. If we didn't have rules, his wife would say, these children would eat us alive. Since Dallas and Florida had lived in the Boxton Creek home longer than any of the other children there, they knew all the rules. They also knew the punishments for disobeying the rules, and they knew them well because they'd broken every rule in the Boxton Creek home many times. How can we live every day of our lives without running or shouting or throwing or talking or dropping or spilling? Dallas had once asked Mr. Trepid. Thinking corner, 2 hours, was Mr. Trepid's reply. As he sat in the dark corner of the basement, Dallas imagined a broad field rimmed with trees. In that imaginary field, he ran and shouted and threw sticks and mud. When he was tired, he lay down in the green grass and felt himself getting smaller and smaller until he was a little baby lying in the grass, and someone with a sweet face leaned down and wrapped him in a white blanket. When Florida was caught breaking one of the rules, she was more likely to argue, and as a result, to earn extra punishments. She couldn't sit still, she couldn't walk when her feet wanted to run, and so on a fairly regular basis she'd be running down the hall, and Mrs. Trippett's long, skinny arm would dart out from a doorway, snare Florida, and lead her to the nearest copy of the rules. "What does that say?" Mrs. Trippett demanded. Florida squinted at the sign. "No stupid running." "It does not say that," Mrs. Trippett said, urging Florida's face closer to the sign. "Read it again." "No stinking stupid running." Down to the basement, 2 hours in the thinking corner. "That's stupid." Followed by 2 hours of floor scrubbing. "Putrid." Followed by 2 hours of weed pulling. Dallas and Florida had racked up hundreds of hours in the thinking corner, the damp, dark, cobwebbed corner of the basement. They had worn the scratchy "I've been bad" shirts, shoveled manure, crawled across acres of fields pulling weeds. They had also peeled potatoes, scrubbed pots and floors, washed windows, and hauled boxes and broken furniture. Good hard thinking and good hard work never hurt anybody, Mr. Treppitt would say. Mr. Treppitt, who was a short, squat man with an awkward walk like a crab scuttling across the ocean floor, did not particularly like thinking or working himself, but he firmly believed that these were good things for children. The home was a misfit operation, lost over the years in a larger system. Funds dribbled in, but social workers no longer came to check on the children. Health workers and building inspectors no longer came to inspect the building. There was no longer a doctor on staff or secretarial help. It was run solely by the Trippetts with the help of their overworked assistant Morgan, who referred to herself as Chief Gopher. Still, the Boxton Creek home was as much a home as Dallas and Florida had ever known. On the front of the building, faded yellow paint curled in strips like peeling skin. Behind the main building, a string of smaller cubes had been added and a crooked path out of the back. Dallas thought it looked like a string of mixed-matched boxcars laid end to end. Florida thought it looked like a dragon with its huge mouth at the front door waiting to swallow up children who entered it. When children first came to the Boxton Creek home, they stayed in one of the bigger rooms in front. But gradually, as the years went on, if they'd not been placed elsewhere, they were shunted farther and farther to the back, to the dark, low-ceilinged, airless rooms at the tail of the house. Rotation, Mr. Trippitt called it. Rotation. Children came and went. Some were taken in by foster families or adopted. A few ran away, but were inevitably returned. One died in his bed, whispering, "Who am I? Who am I?" And although Mr. and Mrs. Trippitt had tried their best to move Dallas and Florida out, or rather, as Mrs. Trippitt explained it to them, to find you a lovely home, the twins were always brought back to the big front door by exasperated adults. Trouble twins, these exasperated adults would say. Nothing but trouble. In turn, Dallas and Florida had come to think that most adults were trouble grown-ups, for that had been their experience, that most grown-ups they'd encountered were short-tempered, impatient, and quick to punish. They had no way of knowing that there were foster parents and adopting parents who were kind and loving and generous and forgiving. In the narrow world of Dallas and Florida, an adult was someone to escape. Over the years, Dallas and Florida had been squeezed toward the back of the Boxton Creek home until they'd come to the end of it, where two cubicles huddled side by side. In each was a narrow, lumpy bed, a slim dresser rammed up close to the bed, and a closet. A single bare bulb dangled from each ceiling. At night, Dallas and Florida listened to the wail of freight trains making their way through Boxton and on to where? To other places, far and wide, to beautiful places, peaceful ones, friendly ones. Dallas and Florida had a plan. They wouldn't be in Boxton Creek home forever. They were going to jump on the night freight train and ride right out of town. Soon. Chapter 3 is called Ruby Holler. 20 miles from Boxton was Ruby Holler, a lush green hidden valley with only 2 cabins nestled in its depths. The cabin at the far end was inhabited by a man who lived on his own and who kept to himself. In the cabin in the middle of the holler lived a 60-year-old man and his wife. One warm morning in June, the man and his wife sat on their porch swing. Same old view, the man grumbled. Same old sagging porch, same old creaky swing. You're pretty grouchy this morning, said his wife. I'm tired of hauling water and chopping wood. Do you think people are right then? His wife asked. Should we move? Get a condo somewhere? Have electricity and heat and a washing machine and one of those air conditioner things? Her husband nodded. And a television, maybe, and a garage with one of those automatic doors? Sure would be different, his wife said. Sure would, the man agreed. A small gray bird swooped down from the sky and landed on the porch railing. It cocked its head at the couple as if it were listening to them. Chapter 4 is called Mush. Dallas and Florida sat at their usual places in the far corner of the narrow dining room in the Boxton Creek home. They weren't allowed to sit on the long benches with the other children because the Trepids didn't want the other children to learn any bad habits from Florida and Dallas. The Trepids would have preferred Dallas and Florida to be meek and cowed like the others. Florida poked at the mush on her plate. Do you think there's any real food in this glop? Might be, Dallas said. I think I spy a piece of meat stuff. He tentatively stabbed the chunk of meat, imagining that it was a steak. The juiciest, best steak in the world. Well, I think it's chopped up cardboard, Florida said, and ground tree bark with a dash of hog's blood thrown in for color. She caught the eye of the new girl on the end of the long bench and waved at her. Uh-oh, Dallas said as he spotted Mr. Trepid slipping up behind Florida. Ow, Florida said. What are you whacking my head for? Keep your hands to yourself, Mr. Trepid ordered. Dallas stared at Mr. Trepid's gold tooth. He imagined himself as a dentist removing that gold tooth, pocketing it, and refitting Mr. Trepid with something else. Maybe something red. Maybe plastic shaped like a fang. My hands are to myself, Florida told Mr. Trepid. Look, see how they're attached to my arms? Quit whacking me on my head. I'll quit whacking you on the head when you put your hands in your lap where they're supposed to be. Florida placed her hands in her lap, and when Mr. Trepid moved away, Dallas said, How are you going to eat with your hands in your lap? Florida leaned forward and lapped at the mush with her tongue. Mr. Trepid returned in a flash. My hands are in my lap. Eat with your fork, Mr. Trepid ordered. Well, how am I supposed to do that if my hands are in my lap? Florida said. Dallas was eyeing his plate, trying not to move a muscle. If he laughed, Mr. Trepid would smack him. The new girl was staring at Florida and Mr. Trepid. Does he do that to everybody? She whispered to the boy next to her. The boy looked terrified. With one hand he covered his mouth, and with the other he gestured at the rules posted on the wall. The first rule in the dining room was no talking. At 7:30 the buzzer sounded. Dallas washed the last pan and tossed it on the shelf. To the palace, he said. Florida raced down the hall to the grimy, dark dungeon of the decrepit palace. Quit that running, quit that shouting, Mrs. Trepid yelled. Get in your rooms. Down the hall they ran, zipping in and out of other children's rooms. The other children laughed at Dallas and Florida, but quickly closed their doors after they'd passed. Laughing at Dallas and Florida was a serious offense in the eyes of the Trepids. Once inside their rooms, Dallas and Florida had each pried up a loose floorboard and deposited their takings from the kitchen. One nearly whole piece of bread and one raw potato each. It was always good to know that there was something under the boards, something to stave off hunger in the night. Later that night, Florida tossed and turned. She dreamed about the Hoppers and then woke up mad at herself for letting the Hoppers into her dreams and now into her waking thoughts. She and Dallas were 5 years old when they were sent to the Hoppers. For the first few days, they thought they'd landed in heaven. They had their own room, and every day the Hoppers gave them a new toy. But then Mrs. Hopper started getting headaches and kept asking them to be quiet and not to touch things. Dallas and Florida had tried to be quiet and tried not to touch things, but sometimes they forgot. One day, Florida picked up a $10 bill that was lying on the kitchen counter. She was studying the pictures on it when Mr. Hopper snatched it from her and slapped her arm. Don't you ever steal from me, you hear? He looked very mean, way up there, glaring down at her, and her insides felt jumbled and queasy. She started noticing little piles of money everywhere. A pile of bills on the kitchen table, a few more on the bookcase, a jar full of quarters. She wasn't ever going to touch their money, ever. One day she came downstairs and saw Dallas sitting on the living room floor with a jar of quarters in front of him. His hand was dipped way inside and he was swirling the quarters around. Mr. Hopper bolted into the room and grabbed the jar, wrenching Dallas's hand out of it. "You little thief!" Mr. Hopper said. Florida seized the jar from Mr. Hopper and smashed it on the floor, sending quarters and shards of glass spattering across the floor like hundreds of silver beetles. The next day, Dallas and Florida were back at the Boxton Creek home. Mr. Hopper told the Trepids that he and Mrs. Hopper had made a mistake. They weren't ready for children. If Florida had been older, she might have felt that Mr. Hopper was right and that she was lucky to be away from the Hoppers. But she wasn't older. She was 5, and what she felt was that she and Dallas had been very bad and they would never be in a real family. Now in her room at the Boxton Creek home, Florida wondered why she had dreamed about the Hoppers. They were neither the first nor the last family that Dallas and Florida had been sent to. They were certainly not the worst. As she drifted back to sleep, though, she was swallowed by another nightmare about the Hoppers. Next door, Dallas heard Florida whimpering. He crept to his closet and lifted the cardboard flap covering a hole in the wall. "Florida, what's the matter?" Florida sat up and looked around. She slipped out of bed, tiptoed into her closet, and knelt beside the hole. "I was having a maggoty nightmare about those Hopper people," she said. "Don't think about them," Dallas said. "Erase them. Someday we'll get on that freight train and ride out of town and we'll be on our own. We won't have to put up with people like that. Someday we'll live in a beautiful place and—" On he went like that until Florida calmed down and curled up on the floor of her closet and fell asleep. Chapter 5 is called Thinking Corners. Dallas had been showing one of the younger boys how to throw a tennis ball over the roof of the Boxton Creek home. You pull your arm back like this, see? You have to aim high, and at the last minute snap your wrist like this, see? The ball sailed upward, curving toward the roof, but veered suddenly, crashing into a window. Now Dallas sat on a stool in the basement thinking corner. The first few minutes in the corner were the hardest, because he'd see that damp cement wall and the ghostly cobwebs and spiders. He'd be reminded of a cellar that he and Florida had once been locked in. He closed his eyes. "Not going there," he told himself. "Not going into that cellar. Going somewhere else. Going somewhere green and sunny. Going where there are trees and birds." And soon enough he was there in his mind, in the place where trails wound through the woods and where a boy could throw anything he wanted and it wouldn't get him in trouble. 2 hours later, Mr. Trepid opened the basement door and called down to Dallas, "Out of there, boy. Got another reservation for that space." As Dallas climbed the steps, he saw Florida standing beside Mr. Trepid, trying to wriggle out of his grasp. "I was just running. I didn't mean to stomp on those flowers," she told Mr. Trepid. "And that hole in the wall, I was just trying to get a little air in that putrid room." "You just go down there and think about it," Mr. Trepid said. As Florida passed Dallas on the steps, she said, "My turn. Hope you kept the seat warm." Florida stomped across the basement room and kicked the wall and the stool. "I heard that," Mr. Trepid called from above. "You've just earned yourself an extra hour down there." Putrid man, Florida thought. Putrid basement, putrid thinking corner. She sat on the stool, her arms crossed. "He can't make me think if I don't want to." She tried to make her mind a blank white canvas, but it was hard. But as hard as she tried, she couldn't keep the canvas blank. Splotches found their way onto it, splotches which turned into images, which turned into people. That morning she'd seen a woman pass by the home. The woman was tall and large-boned, with frizzy, unruly hair. "That's a little bit like my hair," Florida had thought. "Hey, Mom," she called. The woman, startled, turned to Florida, who immediately ducked back in the doorway of the home. Florida peeked around the door, watching the woman hurry away. Now in the basement thinking corner, Florida saw that woman again in her mind, and she thought, well, she could have been my mother. And that reminded her of the man she'd seen with Mr. Trepid the night before in the alley behind the home. The man's back was to her, but he stood in a sort of loose-limbed way, his feet splayed out, his arms swinging at his sides. For some reason, his standing like that reminded her of Dallas. She almost called out, "Hey, Dad!" But the man had turned and saw his matted hair, and there was something about him that frightened her. She was glad she hadn't called out to him. My father wouldn't look like that, she thought. Now she opened her eyes and saw a spider scurrying down the wall. She hopped off her seat, picked up the stool, and hurled it against the wall, smashing the spider. The basement door opened. Mr. Trepid said, "I heard that. Keep that up and you're going to be down there all day." Chapter 6 is called The Opportunity. Mrs. Trepid had a hold of Florida. Let me start that over. Mrs. Trippett had a hold of Florida's arm and was pulling her down the hall. I wasn't doing anything honest, Florida said. Where are you taking me? Mr. Trippett dragged Dallas in through the back door. I was just digging up some worms, Dallas protested. And are you accidentally squeezing my arm? Mr. and Mrs. Trippett ushered Florida and Dallas into their office and closed the door. Don't sit down, you're a mess, Mrs. Trippett said. I wasn't going to sit anywhere anyway, Florida said. Take off those I've been bad shirts and put on these clean ones, Mr. Trippett ordered. What for? Florida asked. You said we had to wear these scratchy, smelly, putrid things for the rest of the week. Take 'em off, Mr. Trippett repeated. You're going somewhere. Florida flashed a look at Dallas. They'd heard this before, too many times. No, we're not, Florida said. We're going to be here till we die. Mrs. Trippett sank into a chair. I certainly hope not, she said. I certainly pray that that's not the case. Mr. Trippett said, We have an opportunity for you, a splendid opportunity. He looked at his wife. Don't we, Mrs. T? Don't we have a splendid opportunity for these two young people? We're not going to any more of those foster places, Florida said. If that's what you've got in mind, you can just forget it. Dallas touched Florida's elbow. Well, we might as well if it's the right place, like a mansion or something. As Mr. Trippett smiled a slow smile, the light sparkled off his gold front tooth. This is a grand opportunity. I suppose you could consider it a temporary, very temporary foster arrangement, Mrs. Trippett said. Not going, Florida said. That last place you sent us had more fleas than a mangy dog and a zillion snakes. Not quite a zillion, Dallas said. 100 zillion, Florida said. And lizards, and that guy was crazy. That guy was a lunatic. Mrs. Trippett winced. Perhaps that last placement was ill-advised. But this is a traveling opportunity, Mr. Trippett interrupted. His tongue slithered over his golden tooth. Florida and Dallas exchanged a glance. What sort of traveling are you talking about? Dallas asked. Florida whispered to him, Don't trust 'em. Don't fall for it. They're probably sending us to Siberia. Mrs. Trippett opened a folder on her desk. Let's see, she said, pulling out a pamphlet. There's a river trip across the state to the Rutabaga River. Florida leaned toward the desk. Huh, she said. Mrs. Trippett pulled another pamphlet from her folder. And let's see, there's also a little trip to Kangadoon. Dallas strained to see the pamphlet. You mean the Kangadoon way out in the ocean? That Kangadoon? In his mind, he had already propelled himself there. He was splashing in the ocean. He was running through the hills. Mr. Trippett handed the Rutabaga pamphlet to Florida and the Kangadoon one to Dallas. We have a very, very nice and respectable couple. Don't trust 'em, Florida whispered. Remember that last very, very nice couple with the snakes? Dallas saw himself climbing a tall, tall tree in Kangadoon and perching on a branch high above the hills. He had a spyglass and was surveying the ocean, on the lookout for pirates. Mr. Trippett continued, and this very, very nice and respectable couple are looking for some strapping, strong young people. To do what? Florida said. Be their slaves, hose down their hogs, clean out their snake pits? Mr. Trippett folded his hands as if in prayer. This very, very nice and respectable couple are looking for two young people to accompany them to the Rutabaga River and to Kangadoon now during your summer vacation. Dallas, up in his imaginary tree in Kangadoon, had spotted a ship far out in the ocean. Pirates. However, Mrs. Trippett said, they're not going together. They need one person to go to the Rutabaga and one to go to Kangadoon. You mean we'd be split up? Florida said. You can't do that. We're not splitting up. We're never splitting up. It's only for 3 months, Mrs. Trippett said. To her husband, she added, unfortunately. Dallas blinked himself back to Mr. and Mrs. Trippett's office. Do we get to meet these pirates first? He asked. What pirates? Mrs. Trippett said. What on earth are you talking about? The people, Florida said. Do we get to meet them and see if they're a couple of lunatics or what? Mrs. Trippett smiled. But of course, Mr. T, she said. Mr. Trippett scuttled out of the office and returned within minutes with a white-haired couple. Allow me to introduce Mr. Tiller Mowry and his wife Sari, he said. Dallas stared at the man whose left eye looked a bit droopy. Maybe he'd worn a patch there. Florida looked at Dallas. A couple of lunatics, she whispered. A couple of old lunatics. Chapter 7 is called Doubts. Dallas and Florida crawled into their closets and lifted the floorboard covering in the hole in the wall. "What do you think about those lunatics?" Florida whispered. "They seemed okay," Dallas said. "Better than the usual sort. They smiled a lot." "Yeah, well, those Hoppers and Cranbeps and Burgertons and those creepy drape people all smiled too, till they got a dose of us." Dallas was thinking about the trip to Kangadoon. He saw himself on the island and in the ocean, making a campfire, and the waves were lapping in the distance. "What if these old lunatics are like that last pair?" Florida said. "That slimeball slave driver and his twitchy wife." "Maybe these two are different," Dallas said. "Doubt it. Maybe we should just get on that night train like we planned." "What about money?" Dallas said. "We need a little money." "We're never going to get any money," Florida said. "If we wait till money falls into our laps, we're going to be here forever." "Did you look at your pamphlet?" Dallas asked. "How does that Rutabaga River look?" "Like paradise," she said. "It's probably fake. What's that Kangadoon look like?" "Double paradise." "What's the catch?" Florida said. "What do you think is the real story behind these old people saying they're going to take us on these trips?" "They're not that old. Maybe there isn't a catch," Dallas said. "And maybe there is," Florida said. "I hate it here, but I hate it worse, going to these crazy people's houses and getting yelled at and scolded and told that we're loud and messy and stupid." "I know it," Dallas said, "but maybe." Yeah, you always say, "but maybe," and it's never any better, and usually it's worse, and I'm sick of it. I vote for the freight train. "Let's just look at those pamphlets one more time and think about it tonight," Dallas said. "Okay?" Later, as Florida lay in bed listening to the wail of the freight trains passing through Boxton, she thought about the old lunatics and about going down a river in a boat. She wanted to be on that boat on the river, but she wanted to be there with Dallas, not with the old man. She hated the thought of being separated from Dallas. She felt that the only reason they'd survived this long without turning into cowardly wimps or juvenile delinquents was because they'd had each other. In the room next door, Dallas counted the wheels of the train. He saw himself in Kangadoon, wading barefoot along the shore. The sky was blue, and the water was blue, and the sun beamed down. Footprints on the sand. He whirled around, drew his sword. That's the end of chapter 7, and we're going to stop right there for today.